Hello and welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine Today. We are at the Kyiv Post Tiger Conference here in Kyiv, which aims to get international and local voices to discuss the social progress in the new Ukraine. We're joined by Euan MacDonald. He is an editor at the English language newspaper Kyiv Post, and he's been working as a journalist in Ukraine for over a decade. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Thanks.
So the war in the East, there's been some recent an upscale in fighting by the Russian-backed militants. They've been firing at Ukrainian positions. So what can you tell us? What's changed, and why has the attacks increased since September?
Well, the attacks that we're seeing just now are basically following a pattern that we have seen since the initial Minsk agreements of September 2014. The fighting goes down and then gradually escalates to a certain peak and then will fall off again. And we're in one of the escalation points just now. We don't really know whether it could get worse or it will get better. It really depends on what Mr. Putin has in mind.
And it doesn't depend on Russia's other military interventions in other states.
I think there possibly is. There is obviously a connection, because Russia, although it's viewed as being a very great military power, it's not as strong as some people would have it, and it is a stretch for Russia to maintain a military adventure in Syria and still maintain full readiness for an escalation in Ukraine. But we do know that there are Russian units on training in Rostov Oblast and not far away from Ukraine, and they're ready to go basically if Mr. Putin gives the word.
Do you see that there is a change in the Russian tactics since the start of the war and now?
There's not really been a change in the tactics. The tactics are always opportunistic. Whenever an opportunity provides itself, they will take it. So there was the case of the Ilovaisk massacre, where Ukraine's military got itself into a pretty hopeless position, and this was at a point when Ukraine was on the advance. But they overreached themselves in the sense that they probably didn't expect the Russians to come in the way that they did, and basically they halted the collapse of these republics in the east, of so-called republics, and established the situation as it is almost now in terms of territory. And there was also the case of Debaltseve, which was also a militarily untenable situation for the Ukrainians. Luckily, the commanders on the ground, I believe, saw that, and they managed to get out of that situation in a much better way than obviously what happened in Ilovaisk. So Russia will take advantage of any opportunities that it sees, as far as I judge the situation. If something comes up, they will take it.
But now that winter is approaching once again, do you think that the Ukrainian soldiers are well prepared for the war continuing on in the cold months?
And I think the Ukrainian military is a good deal better prepared this winter than it was last winter. They are getting help from abroad, if even just a little bit. They're getting some winter clothing from Britain.
Not military, not lethal aid.
Not lethal aid, of course, but they are getting the kind of aid which will sustain their ability to be combat ready. So that every little helps. And they are being helped by volunteers. They've done a tremendous amount. And so the Ukrainian military is in a better position to defend the territory. Obviously, we're not talking about going on an offensive, because that would invite more Russian intervention, which I don't think Kyiv would want.
And it's in Kyiv's interest to not go on offensive, or to keep on the defense?
I think it's in Kyiv's interest to keep the situation as stable as it can at the moment. And hope against hope that Russia will start to implement its side of the Minsk bargain, withdraw its troops, withdraw its support, allow Ukraine to re-establish control over its border. I don't actually see that happening, because if Ukraine did re-establish control over its border, that would effectively mean the end of the republics, as it were. They would effectively become part of Ukraine again. nominally independent, but they would not be, their chances of expanding control would be cut off, because they wouldn't have an access to Russian ammunition and supplies and fighters coming across this free border.
A big part of the fighting has been done from the Ukrainian side by the volunteer battalions, and now they're part of the Ministry of Defense, a large part of them, not all of them. And is this a disadvantage or an advantage for the Ukrainian army?
It's an advantage. These are highly motivated soldiers who've seen combat, a lot of combat, very difficult situations. They have a lot to probably tell their other comrades in other units about what it's like to fight this kind of...
But of course they're not professional soldiers, they don't have the kind of training, but they've been out east.
Yeah, they have been out. They've got training on the job, as it were. But they know very much what it's like to be involved in this kind of very static, artillery-based war, which is not something that has been seen in this part of Europe or in Europe in general for a very long time, almost since the First World War. It's an artillery war.
What about some of the disadvantages that these volunteer battalions bring to the table?
Well, there's been a lot said about some of say the Azov battalion having a leadership that's right-wing or even far-right or even Nazi. Some of the symbols that they have look very uncomfortable to the eye. Some of them do recall Nazi movements or Nazi symbols. I think that's probably overblown, but it still is a worry. This is not the kind of, it's not a very good image for Ukraine to have these kind of people in charge of battalions and being associated with the national military. So it's a good thing that they've become incorporated into the Ukrainian army, but there's still, Ukraine still has an image problem with them.
What are some of your predictions for the coming months?
Well, on the optimistic scenario is things again cool down to what we saw in September, where there was practically a ceasefire. We have to remember that there never has been a ceasefire in Ukraine since September 2014, when the Minsk Accords were agreed. There was supposed to be a ceasefire, there hasn't been one. The level of fighting has escalated, de-escalated, gone up and down. Only this past September, did we see anything close to a proper ceasefire. If we could return to that, that would be the optimistic scenario. Pessimistic scenario is that the situation with Crimea and its energy blockade prompts more actions by Russia against Ukraine, and possibly they could include military actions via their proxy forces in the Donbas. People are speculating about that. Some have said that the current rise in fighting could be connected with that. I'm not so sure myself, but that is the pessimistic scenario.
So it seems quite a few scenarios ahead.
Well, there's a lot of talk of there being a frozen conflict. The
Ukrainian government seems to be quite avoiding to label the conflict in the east as a frozen conflict. They want to avoid that label altogether. Yeah,
there are logical ways. There are logical reasons for that, because it's not a frozen conflict. It's really quite a warm conflict at the moment. It's still, you still have two armies facing each other, regularly shooting at each other, exchanging fire. And they have a lot of hardware on both sides quite close to each other, although a lot of the hardware is supposed to have been withdrawn, and it has indeed, as far as we can tell on the Ukrainian side, that they have withdrawn their hardware. It can still get to the front quite easily and quite quickly. On the DNR and LNR side, obviously the OSCE has much less ability to move around freely and monitor what's going on. So there are reports I see every day from just from social media and people actually in the area reporting movements of columns of tanks and troops around. So they could very easily, I'm quite sure, start a mini offensive like the type we saw during the summer, where they made attacks on towns all along the borderline. that's quite a possibility.
I see. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
This has been Mr. Euan MacDonald. He's an editor at the Kyiv Post, and he has been working as a journalist in Ukraine for over a decade. You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today.